I would now like to invite Brian Hetherington, who is the Chief Counsel, Empire Justice Center, to come forward and please introduce our keynote speaker for today's luncheon. Brian?
I'm pleased to introduce to you Jean Nichol, a professor of law at the University of North Carolina and the director of the University Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity. The center has an ambitious and impressive set of goals that align well with the goals of Action for a Better Community. They seek to address the pressing needs of those currently living at or below the poverty level. They seek to provide an interdisciplinary forum to examine innovative and practical ideas to move men, women, and children out of poverty, to raise public awareness of issues related to work and poverty, and to train a new generation to combat the causes and effects of poverty and to improve the circumstances of working people. Professor Nichol, who played varsity football while an undergraduate at Oklahoma State, received his law degree from the University of Texas Law School and had a distinguished career as a law professor, then the dean of 2 law schools, at first at the University of Colorado and then at the University of North Carolina, and finally as a college president at William & Mary before returning to the University of North Carolina. He did not allow the fact that college presidents and law school deans spend so much of their time with rich folks, asking them for money, to warp his values. He's written and taught throughout his career on issues of poverty, race, and access to justice. His writings show him to be what Professor Cornel West calls a prisoner of hope, someone who understands that the world is a wicked and difficult place, and yet who remains faithful to and acts on the belief of Dr. King that the moral arc of the universe, while long, bends towards justice. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Jean R. Nichol, Director of the Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity at the University of North Carolina, whose presentation is entitled Forgetting Equality, American Poverty, and the Challenge of Economic Justice.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that long and generous introduction. Whenever I hear that whole story, my basic reaction is probably like yours. This sounds like somebody who has a hard time holding on to a job. And if you knew the story better, you'd probably think that even more. It is true that unlike some in my line of work, I played football at Oklahoma State as an undergraduate, which means I was a philosophy major and an undergraduate. I had 2 very different sets of friends. One group, everybody weighed about 78 pounds. They were almost all from India, and they spoke about ahimsa. The other group averaged about 320 pounds, didn't speak any language at all. And I had a hard time bringing the 2 of them together. I did go to Oklahoma State. I grew up in Mesquite, Texas. Ryan was kind not to do something. I was introduced about 2 weeks ago by a judge who said that it was only because I had grown up in Mesquite, Texas, that I could have considered Oklahoma State to be an institution of higher learning. I reject that, but I'm delighted to be here. There are several reasons for that. One, I live in Chapel Hill, which is known as the southern part of heaven. It was about 79 degrees last night when I left. I just gave a talk 3 or 4 days ago down in Miami, and 4 days before that in California. So I looked at the forecast, and the only place I could find the potential for sleet and snow was Rochester. Decided to hop on a plane quick as I could. Secondly, my father, who worked for a printing company in Mesquite, Texas, from the time that he was 14 till he retired at 65. Never got on an airplane, never traveled out of Texas, except at one point, every 5 years, he started having to come to Rochester, New York, in order to go to a school at Eastman Kodak. It was his only travel out of Texas. I know he didn't like getting on planes. He still didn't like it. He thought that this place was full of Yankees. But he thought Kodak hung the moon. So I have heard about Rochester from an unlikely source. The home, of course, for someone like me, of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, serious people, serious members, people who changed the world, people who, by the way, as you might know, didn't always agree. All those people involved in working to change the world in this room, I bet you don't always agree either, for that matter. But it's a real honor to be here, to be amongst people who work so hard against the odds in the vineyard of poverty, working, as Dr. King put it, to try and make real the promises of democracy. It is a huge honor to be in the room with these award winners, with Miss Katie and Dr. Anderson, and with our representatives of Miss Saudi, who've worked to carry out, day in and day out, Václav Havel's definition of hope, which he described not as a description of the world around us or a prediction of success, but a predisposition of the spirit, a predilection of the heart, choosing to live in the conscious belief that we can make a difference in the quality of our shared and threatened lives. The nobler, when you think about it, the nobler of contested hypotheses. My hat is off to you. It's an honor to be in the room. I'm also glad to have an important assignment to talk about the challenges of American equality and community action and equal dignity and full membership and participation. I have been a law school dean or a university president for almost all of the last 25 years. I was surprised during those long tenures how often deans and presidents are called upon not to give important speeches, but to give what I came to think of as warm and mindless remarks. That is, you know the drill, comments to touch the affections and perhaps the pocketbooks of various alumni and friends of the institution, never to say anything strident, never to say anything controversial, never to say anything meaningful, never to say anything worth listening to. I was surprised, to be honest, how big a part of the job of being a university president the giving of warm and mindless remarks was. I was even more surprised when my faculty colleagues started saying almost uniformly that I was really very good at giving warm and mindless remarks, that I was something of a natural for it. So this is fair warning. I'm going to depart from my usual habits and what are apparently my best talents. But if a little later I forget myself and I start asking you for money for the University of North Carolina, please forgive me. Old habits die hard. It's also true that I was coming in. I met a couple of people who had read something about me and they said that I don't look exactly the way they expected a distinguished law school dean or university president to look. And I hear this with some frequency as I go around. At first I took it as a compliment. I thought that maybe I don't look as arrogant or as nerdy as is generally called for in my line of work. But I gradually realized people were just saying I'm a lot bigger than they ever expected a law school dean to look. I explained this to my wife of 28 years, who said, I'm sure kindly, that I'm a lot bigger than she ever expected me to look either. So you're in good company. Let me begin by saying what a fan I am of the Community Action Mission, of ABC's work, these remarkable agencies, remarkable people, giving voice and effectiveness to the poor and the threatened and the marginalized, believing in the empowerment of community, in the enabling prospect of self-sufficiency, tracing your roots, of course, to the war on poverty. I remembered the other day Lyndon Johnson's words in 1965 in declaring an unconditional war on poverty, a war that, he said, the richest nation on earth can afford to win and cannot afford to lose. Johnson began by saying that I don't know if I'll pass a single law or fund a single program, but before I'm through, not a community in America will be able to ignore the poverty within its midst. We have proven more steadfast in our ability to ignore the poverty within our midst than Johnson would ever have predicted. As North Carolina's governor at the time, Terry Sanford, put it, we didn't lose that war on poverty. We abandoned the field. But those were telling words from an American president. God knows it would be good to hear them today. Almost 50 years ago now, Lyndon Johnson told the graduating students at the University of Michigan, in a land of great wealth, families must not live in hopeless poverty. In a land rich in harvest, children just must not go hungry. In a land of healing miracles, neighbors must not suffer and die unattended. In a great land of learning and scholars, young people must not go uneducated. I think it would break his big, complicated, hypocritical, outrageous Southern heart to know how powerfully his words are still needed today. But that is not my assignment. I'm not here to give a history lesson. There's too much going on for that. The times are too daunting, too potentially terrible, challenging times for so many in America. James has outlined these figures of poverty. Let me just put a point on it by saying this very afternoon, there are more Americans living in poverty, more citizens of New York living in poverty, more citizens of Rochester living in poverty than in any moment in American history. No surprise, we learned 2 weeks ago of the dramatic rise in poverty over the last 18 months. Outrageous numbers in such a wealthy society, far higher, of course, for blacks and Latinos, and even more pronounced for children. At least 25% of American kids right now living in poverty. And as you know, those numbers in Rochester are nearly double that. We also have, apart from privation and barriers and lack of dignity, a structural challenge which people in this room run into every day. One way to think about it, the median wage of the American worker has fallen in real terms, literally, in the last 30 years. So if we put it in sexist terms, like you might with my daddy, said if we could find that middle American, wherever he is out there, pinpoint it, he would be making less money today than his daddy made 30 years ago. Something else has happened in that intervening 30 years. 30 years ago, the top 1% in the United States were bringing home 8% of our total income. Not a bad proportion. This year, the top 1% will bring home more than 25% of our total income. So as most of us have fallen back, the top 1% has more than tripled its share. A study last week showed that in 2010, corporate profits, for the first time, accounted for the highest proportion of our total income in American history. The percentage of income devoted to wages and salaries fell to 49.9%, the lowest ever. And the Pew Research Center 2 weeks ago found that the median wealth of white households is now across the country 20 times that of black households, 18 times that of Hispanic families, the largest racial gap in wealth since the government began collecting data. And as these poverty rates have soared, and you have seen this in your communities, the New York Times 2 weeks ago reported another telling national trend. Gucci high-end sales were up 24% last quarter. Tiffany's quarterly figures rose by 22%. Purchase of Mercedes-Benz S-Class sedans that cost over $200,000 jumped 14% in the United States last quarter. Neiman Marcus flatly sold out of something called Christian Louboutin Bianca platform pumps at $1,000 a pair. Now, I might have pronounced that wrong. And I asked my wife, and thankfully she didn't know if it was right or wrong either. Though the same story reported that Walmart had to begin selling smaller packages because its shoppers did not have enough money on hand to afford multi-packs of toilet paper. On both sides of the political aisle, we seem to be settling into a understanding, a sort of framework, which says something like this: well, we've moved past these greatest dangers. The banks and the Wall Street are restored, but now the rest of us are going to have to pay the bill. The gravy train is over. There is no more easy ride. We've got to start digging ourselves out. It's been too easy a slide. Now we're going to have to work harder, learn better, teach better, do more with much less, quit loafing, as if it wasn't the swells that drove us over the cliff in a frenzy of greed and fraud. As if it was, I guess, that waitresses and coal miners got lazy and decided to coast, and that families no longer wanted to save to stretch to make it possible for their kids to go to college, or folks on Medicaid decided they enjoyed being sick, or all of a sudden 20% of us, near 20%, decided that full-time work wasn't all it was cracked up to be. This is a challenging presupposition, but it does bring into the focus something that I want to talk about this morning. Lots of us believe, I think correctly, that we've spent much of the last, I suppose you'd say 3 years, responding to great exigency, great emergency, dangers that we thought across the board as a people that we simply couldn't countenance. And think with me for just a minute about what we did. An $800 billion bank bailout, a $787 billion stimulus package, a mere $45 billion for Detroit, many billions for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and AIG and Bank of America and Citigroup. The list is long. And surely for working Americans, it is not only breathtaking, but can be nauseating. But this is my point. We faced danger and jeopardy, and so we cast aside old conventions. Lindsey Graham, conservative Republican senator from South Carolina, saying at one point 2 years ago that we need to nationalize the banks. Lindsey Graham. Newsweek magazine, you'll remember it, splashed across its cover, "We are all socialists now." The Wall Street Journal saying we have to have this bailout. This is market failure. Paul Ryan saying exactly the same thing. We acted, and we acted broadly, because we believed we were in dramatic exigency. We faced risks that most of us thought unacceptable, so we chose to act. And I would say act we should, even if it entails stepping out into the dark, because when your children's future is at stake, you act. Better to partially misstep in potential error than to sit back and let the darkness descend. Better to act in courage and dedication. I know this is true. I don't dispute it. But I want to spend a few moments in the time I have left talking about the other side of that very coin. The side of the coin that now for 25 years and more we have thought to be acceptable. A status quo that we have believed required no emergency response, that we could willingly and easily accommodate ourselves to, adjust ourselves to. A permissible and even untroubling status quo. A status quo that demanded from us nothing out of the ordinary. And I was thinking in this regard that Dr. King described himself, just before he died, as chronically unsatisfied, as a malcontent, as maladjusted. I never did intend to adjust myself, he wrote, to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries for the few. So Dr. King claimed, not long before his death, I call upon all persons of good will to be maladjusted. And I think he might say to us, why, even before the difficulties of the last 3 years, why in the salad days of the last 3 decades have we been satisfied? How can we have been satisfied when in the wealthiest nation on earth, the wealthiest nation in human history, over 15% of us, some 49 millions, live in stark, unrelenting poverty? And James is right, those are stark figures. Figures far worse than other advanced Western democracies would countenance. A poverty that is skewed by race, between 25% for blacks and Latinos and Native Americans. A poverty to our shame that is skewed by age, with the youngest and most vulnerable, the poorest among us. Now at least 1 in 4 kids, 1 in 3 black kids, 4 in 10 Hispanics. No other Western industrial nation permits anything like the high rate of child poverty that we embrace. As if any theory of justice or virtue, no matter how you frame it, could explain the exclusion of innocent children from the American dream. And how can we have been satisfied when, despite our claims of equal opportunity and dignity and that we're all in this together, the top 1% over the last 2 decades has had more wealth than the bottom 60% combined? And our income gap between rich and poor is greater than it has been since we started collecting the data 5 decades ago, and is now, I suppose, we have the bragging rights of being documented to have the highest gap between rich and poor in the industrial world. While over 50 million of Americans are said to be euphemistically food insecure. They don't have enough to eat. And how can we have been satisfied over all of the last decade, as more than 40 million of us have had no health care coverage of any kind? Last year, 52 million, leaving us alone among the major industrial nations in failing to have some form of universal coverage, even though, as Dr. King indicated, inequity in access to health is the most pernicious discrimination of all. Among the major industrial nations, we rank first in wealth, first in military expenditures, first in gross domestic product, first in millionaires, first in billionaires, first in health technology spending, but only 13th in standard of living for the poorest fifth of society, 14th in efforts to lift children out of poverty, 16th in number of low birth weight babies, amazingly 23rd of 25 in infant mortality, and to our eternal shame, 25th of 25 in children killed by gun violence. And how can we have been satisfied and unmoved when across so much of the United States, across North Carolina, across Virginia, much of the nation, we allow rich and poor public schools, not just private schools, mind you, rich and poor public schools, leading us to worry that the term at risk will become a description of a child's fate rather than his starting point, as if it was thought acceptable to teach some of our kids as second and third and fourth class citizens. Our religions teach, every one of them, that all children are equal in the eyes of God, but we run our schools as if we rejected that. And how can we have been satisfied and untroubled and unmoved when in higher education, the venue in which I work, a study 2 years ago concluded that American universities are more economically polarized than at any time in the past 4 decades. So that if you come from a family making $90,000 a year or more, your chances of getting a college degree by the time you're 24 are better than 1 in 2. They're frankly about 70%. If you come from a family making $35,000 a year or less, like 1/3 of North Carolinians, then the odds are 1 in 17. 1 in 17. As if wisdom and intellect and ambition and worth were somehow hereditary. And again, in my venue, the legal system, the nation's poor who need assistance the most remain the least likely to get it. Jimmy Carter said 30 years ago, in what I thought was an exaggeration, we have the highest concentration of lawyers on earth, but 90% of them serve only 5% of the people. We are over-lawyered and underrepresented. Study after study indicates that at least 80% of the legal need of the poor is unmet. In New York, in North Carolina, across the United States, fencing out millions on the most crucial issues of life, and making a mockery of the phrase equal justice under law, which is carved on every courthouse wall in every state and every county and every city of the country. And even in our politics, most foundational of all, it still seems that you have to pay in order to play. Are we the only people in the world who believe that our elected officials walk up to total strangers, ask them for thousands or now hundreds of thousands of dollars, get it, and are completely unaffected by it, achieving a state of perfect ingratitude? A system of government in which those who seek certain policies are allowed to give unlimited amounts of money to the people that make the policies, which is what we have. That can be called many things, but democratic and fair are not among them. And finally, how can we have been satisfied when decade after decade, in cultural arena after cultural arena, in election after election, even including this last most historic presidential race, these debilitating disparities are never even discussed at all? In law and politics, in philosophy, in the academy, sadly, often even in our pulpits, we turn our gaze away from those locked at the bottom of American life, coming to think of a regime of economic apartheid as unassailable and unavoidable and untroubling. Lincoln said that the central purpose of America was that the weak would gradually be made stronger and ultimately all would have an equal chance. But what was central for Lincoln has become foreign for us. The frank truth is, if the exclusions and dignities of American poverty are right, then the Constitution is wrong. If the debilitations of those locked at the bottom are acceptable, then our scriptures are wrong. If these denials of equal citizenship and humanity are permissible, then we pledge allegiance to a cynical illusion, not to a foundational creed. And I think we know it. It's like Lyndon Johnson said, we may not know everything, but we know the difference between chicken shit and chicken salad. Now, people in this room know better than many that many millions of us, of our sisters and brothers, have been in deep, deep exigency long before the crashes of 2008 and 2009. And we have been satisfied with exclusions and barriers and denials of opportunity that we should not have countenanced. Not if we are who we say we are. Not if we believe what we say we believe. Not if we are the people we have assumed ourselves to be. So let me go back one last time to your friend Lyndon Johnson. I have an affinity for overweight Texans with a drawl who like to talk. But Johnson said, under similar circumstance, rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with a challenge, not to our growth or abundance or our security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this task, then we will have failed as a people and a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? For what does it profit if he should lose his soul? This work, the work of these community action agencies, the work of poverty, the work of equality, in which so many of you are engaged, this is, frankly put, the work of the nation's soul. I wish it weren't as difficult or as challenging or as lonely as it is. We could wish that there weren't such powerful forces arrayed against it, and that so many, while not ill-motivated, were so willing to turn their gaze away from these transgressions against freedom and dignity and hope. But it is helpful sometimes, when thinking of great challenge, to remember those who have gone before. And if you ponder it, I'm pretty sure Fannie Lou Hamer didn't do an opinion poll before she started the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And Rosa Parks didn't conduct a focus group before she sat down for freedom. And I'm pretty sure that Virginia Soddy didn't ask if it was risky or challenging or easy or comfortable before she went to people's front porches. This isn't the first time that people in this room have been asked to work for justice against the odds. It is your heritage, your defining mission, your naming purpose. So my hope as we conclude is that we'll commit, as we try to bail ourselves out, to a higher calling of citizenship and patriotism and obligation as well, one that recalls first and foremost that we are all in this together, that there can be no excuse for the richest nation on earth talking incessantly about equal opportunity and doing, relatively speaking, so little to bring it to pass, betraying the literal promise of America. So I hope we'll subscribe to it. We'll declare our commitment. We'll enroll our hearts. We'll enlist our spirits. We'll enlist because somewhere we read, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. And somewhere we read that this is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And somewhere we read that history will judge us on the extent to which we've used our gifts to lighten and enrich the lives of our fellows. And somewhere we read that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And somewhere we read, think of this, that we ought to believe the things that we teach our children. Believe them and make them real. And of course, somewhere we read that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And somewhere a lot of us read that whenever you did these things for the least of these, you did them for me. And that same group read, you reap what you sow. And somewhere we read that the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of happiness can be as one. They march not in opposite directions, but hand in hand. And somewhere we read with Dr. King, no, we are not satisfied. And we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Congratulations on your work, and thanks for letting me join you.